Hello, friend. Thanks for pressing play on this episode of the Brassy Broadcast. I'm Jen, the head broad in charge at the Brassy Broadcasting Company. This is the first episode in a series I'm doing with sharp entrepreneurial women that are leveraging their voices to grow their businesses. My guest in this episode is Kate Sitka. Kate is a psychic medium and animal communicator. She's also one of my clients, and I feel like I've really been able to get to know her by hearing her voice as I work on her podcast. In this conversation, Kate shares how she went from blogging only to adding podcasting to the mix, experimenting with our podcasts, viewing our podcast as a body of work, and creating a space for potential clients to get to know you. As always, you can check the show notes for links to any resources we mention. I'll be back after our conversation to share some of my big takeaways. Enjoy this conversation with Kate Sitka, host of the Joyful Telepathy podcast. Friend, you are in for a treat today. Joining me for this episode is Kate Sitka. Kate is a psychic medium, animal communicator, and fellow podcaster that lives in Canada. I'm also very honored to call Kate one of my clients, and she's one of those excellent human beings that I've met just because we both podcast. And when I knew that I wanted to produce my next season exploring how business owners and coaches and consultants incorporate podcasting into the work that they do with their clients, Kate was at the top of my list, and you will find out why over the course of our conversation. Kate, welcome to the Brassy Broadcast.
Oh, thank you, Jen. That was such a sweet introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm so excited that we get to have this conversation and share it because I have to tell you, I always learn something when I'm listening to your podcast and working on it. So it's just like this added bonus of goodness.
Well, I really appreciate that. And, there wouldn't be a podcast without you. I would have given up on podcasting if I hadn't had someone as excellent to work with as you and been able to pawn off the parts of podcasting that I hate. So because I work with you, I get to do the parts of podcasting that I love. So, the feeling is mutual. And I almost, I guess we'll get into this in the conversation, but, because I needed to make podcasting sort of work in my life and on my schedule, I almost feel as though if people were to listen to my show, my sound quality is a little more gritty than, what this podcast is going to be, because I have, I just kind of said, well, if I need to record a podcast in my car while I'm driving, that's what I'm going to do. So if people are going to go over and listen to my podcast, I just want to say, that is not Jen's fault. The reason why it's listenable at all is because Jen engineered it afterwards. So I wanted to give that little cap. Go and listen to my podcast, because honestly, you get, I do it to get the content out there, and I had to make some sacrifices in terms of my recording setup sometimes. But yes, I just wanted to get that little caveat in there.
And that is the Joyful Telepathy podcast.
Yes.
Well, we have so much to talk about. And I would like to start just by talking about the work that you do, because I feel like psychic medium and animal communicator, what exactly does that mean? And how do you work with your clients?
Well, it is... Have you ever been thinking about a friend and then you get a text and you're like, hey, I was just thinking about you?
Yes.
Like most people have had that, we're all kind of tuned into each other on this base level. And there are some of us that were kind of born with that tuned and cranked up a little bit. And with me, it runs in my family. My great grandmother, she was quite widely known over Europe. So I grew up hearing stories of her, and so I grew up with a bit of validation of what I was experiencing. But then you start to learn, you start to train, you start to research, and you start to build your skill set so that things aren't necessarily just happening accidentally. You can start to facilitate these conversations, these little coincidences. You can start to do that on purpose. And so that's the skill set that I have fostered. I was always much more interested in animals as a child than I was talking to people spirits, because animals are they're very straightforward. They're safe to communicate with compared to, people spirits that people can be complex and have very powerful emotions that animals don't necessarily portray. For example, like a sense of urgency or resentment, or, there's lots of things. Animals are very immediate, their needs and their love and what they want, which is an honest, straightforward thing. When I was a child, I found people spirits to be very frightening. And so I just didn't work with them. I just said, go away. And I worked strictly with animals until I was in my 30s. And then by the time I was in my 30s, I'd built my animal communication practice. I had, through trial and error, had created a lot of different techniques to be able to control how I was interacting in this way. So I guess that's the long answer to your question is it's a way of relating to the world. It's a way of utilizing your body as an instrument, as an antenna to pick up this form of communication that we're all capable of and that we all participate in on a certain level. But I've become able to do this more at will, to do this at a higher level, and to be able to provide some accuracy, some confirmation for my clients so that they can know and trust that we've got the right person. And I help to facilitate those conversations so that we can solve some problems. For animals, we might be solving, addressing some behavior problems or some health problems. But oftentimes it's just clients and their animals who want to feel closer, and they want to know, what can I do to, help my dog or my cat or my horse live a happier, healthier life? What are they thinking about? And those sorts of animal communication lessons inevitably result in the human and the animal feeling a lot closer. Because often there are things like, animals can have a sense of humor that humans don't necessarily get right off the bat. But when you realize that that they're understanding so much more than we give them credit for, and that they have their own world, when the human is able to connect with that, and the animal, knows that and has been validated, their relationship gets to be so much closer. And in working so I work with animals that are alive and who have also passed away. And with people, I generally work with, with human spirits, people that have passed away. And often a lot of that is, if there's reassurance that this person that we love didn't completely disappear into the ether. And that's usually the biggest reassurance is, once they get one or two confirmations, then they can feel like, oh, they didn't disappear. They are actually okay. And that's this huge sense of relief. There can be a lot of grief healing that happens. And then sometimes there are conversations. So sometimes there's conflict that needs to be worked out, or sometimes there's just that reconnection. That it's grief, but it creates this joy. That it's like, hey, it's not as easy as picking up the phone and calling mom anymore, but I can book a session with my psychic, one or two times a year. Or like some people will book more frequently than that. And, so my practice is, my tribe of people that tend to book, either once a year or more frequently than that. And then they refer their own friends. And that's how my practice has been growing over the years.
That's great. And podcasting is hard work, as you've alluded to a little bit. So what was it that made you start a podcast? Because you did the blog come first and then the podcast?
Yeah, the blog came first. So I started the blog right when I was making my transition from just a strict animal communicator into people spirits. And I wanted a safe place to work out what I was experiencing. Because the techniques are the same, the basic principles are the same, but it's there's a lot of things that are different. There were some skills that I needed to learn. So I started the blog psychicandtraining.com, and it was anonymous for the first 2 years or something that I was doing it.
Really? Why did you keep it anonymous?
Because I needed a safe space to be able to write about crazy things.
Oh, that makes perfect sense to me.
So, and then after a while, when I gained confidence and I, I launched my business and I started guest blogging, and my name started to get out there a little bit more than I wanted to put my name on my anonymous blog. So it was around that time that I decided I wanted to do a podcast as well, because I love listening to podcasts. That's the main reason I wanted to do a podcast as opposed to any of the other things. Was I loved listening to other psychics on podcasts. And I just loved podcasts in general. I'd been listening to the Savage Love podcast ever since it's first started. Podcasting to me was a way for me to access weird and wonderful things that didn't get into mainstream media.
Truly, yes.
And I knew that I belonged there. I'm weird and I'm wonderful. And I know that there's people that wanted to get to know me more.
Mm-hmm.
And another part of it was blogging was getting demanding. I was getting into more philosophical stuff and, different ideas about like, why does death and the afterlife work this way? Why does telepathic communication work this way? And I wanted a place to be able to just sort of word vomit my thoughts without having to type on a keyboard and then read it over, for readability. I wanted a place where people could go to listen to the more meandering style of my thoughts and, my storytelling style, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a broader vision. I wanted to be able to have guests on the podcast. And I also wanted people who were going to consider working with me as a client. I wanted a place for them to go where they could listen to my voice and hear me talk and hear what I work, hear what I do, hear how I work.
Mm-hmm.
So that by the time they actually book a session with me, they know me really well. And that is what is now happening. People tend to have read my blog for a year or more, and they usually will have binged my entire podcast before they finally book a session with me.
Really?
Yes. So there's sort of that rule of, you're supposed to be posting your podcast, your content regularly,
mm-hmm.
In order to grow it. That's a pretty, regular rule. That's a rule I couldn't follow. I just don't have it in my schedule to maintain that kind of a podcast mistress. So
mm-hmm.
I just did the podcast as I had time and as it was fun for me. And now I have over 60 episodes out there, and people are binging those 60 episodes before they reach out to me. So I kind of knew that that's how it was going to work for me, that I'm not about getting the numbers. I'm about being accessible, creating more of myself that's accessible to the people that do want to book a session with me.
I love that you said that, because I feel like there is so much pressure, like, oh, you got to have the downloads. And then a lot of people go into it with, oh, I want to get sponsorship and all of these big grand plans. And I feel like that's what makes it so overwhelming at times. Yeah. And I love that you're like, you know what? I'm going to do this when it works within my schedule. It just feels so much better. And it's not like you don't have a complete back catalog that people can go in and listen to.
Well, because I knew how I listened to podcasts, and I don't hang on the edge of my seat waiting for a new episode to be released. If I'm going to go on a trip, I will load up all of my favorite podcasts and I will listen to podcasts from years ago. Sometimes if I'm mm-hmm. caught up, I will start at the beginning and I'll start to listen my way through again. I know how I interact with the media, and I don't treat it like a TV show that only comes out once a week. I treat mm-hmm. it like a set of DVDs that I own, that I can experience anytime I want. And if I'm a fan of a particular person, I am going to, watch them over and over and over again. If the content is layered enough, dense enough, nuanced enough, then people are going to get more out of it. So I wanted to create a podcast that was interesting enough that people would want to binge on it, and they would want to listen to episodes maybe multiple times over years. So I knew that I was creating more of a body of work rather than a quote unquote show.
I love that. I love that you're looking at that as a body of work. So, dear listener, and I totally stole that from you, because I love how you communicate with your audience.
Yes.
And it feels like we're old friends.
Yeah.
When I listen to your show. And I feel like I've gotten to know you so much better just through listening to your show, because by the time we're done recording this conversation, this will probably be the longest conversation we've had.
I'm so glad. Well, because we've communicated mostly in email. But, it's not pretend, Jen, because over the years, my clients do become my friends.
Exactly.
Like they get to know me because I put so much of myself out there, and I get to know them because, they're repeat clients, a lot of them. And I know their family history over time, and I care when something happens to their pet, or, or they have an emergency. Like I'm emotionally invested in my clients. I am. And I think a part of it is because I come from a healthcare background, and I believe that emotional involvement is really important for healing. And, you know, so I do, when I address my podcast listeners as friends, I mean it, you know?
Yes. Do you ever have any hesitation? Because I feel like kind of what that magic, how you create that relationship with your listener is that you are very vulnerable with some of the stories that you share.
Yeah.
Is there ever any hesitation with going that deep and sharing that much of yourself?
None at all. Because to me, it's in that vulnerability is what that's where my clients go when they book a session with me. So I need to create a safe space. I need to offer to them, look, I'm going to share my own grief sometimes with you. I'm going to share my own hesitations and doubts, or I'm going to share my own kind of semi-taboo spiritual stories. And I'm going to share, you know, some of the things that are generally accepted principles in the new age community, the new spiritual community. And I'm going to call bullshit on some things that I think are bullshit. The only thing that's really bitten me in the side has actually been family members who listen to the podcast. And I don't know why they listen if they have a problem with it, but they do. And I have had some conflict in my family from people who don't want me talking about personal things. They don't want me talking about my mother, for example.
Really?
Yeah. And because I understand, because they feel that it brings the family into the sense of, you know, vulnerability. But honestly, it's like I know that none of my podcast listeners know who my family members are. I have reined it back even more in talking about, now I'm vaguely referring to family members. Like, I want to respect what they're feeling, but at the same time, it makes me so angry when I feel censored. You know, like when I'm told, you know, like, you shouldn't talk about mom at all. And I'm like, well, my clients are coming to me with their big losses and their big, you know, inner conflicts about loss. You know, when somebody passes, it's very rare that when someone passes, we have just a simple relationship with that person. Somebody has passed and our earthly relationship with them has concluded. And sometimes we go through a grief process about what that relationship wasn't, as much as what that relationship was. And I want to be honest about the things that I'm experiencing, because that creates a safe place for other people to come and discuss that with me, you know, and to destigmatize some of it as well. So, I mean, really the only difficulty that I have had has been with family, I think, kind of misunderstanding my intentions around it, and feeling family members feeling like personally affronted or personally, I'm going to say, violated in a way, because I received some very severe pushback. I also feel like, you know, we have our own stories to tell. And as long as what I am telling is the truth, I have a right to my own story. And I'm going to do my best to respect other people, but I can't pretend like I don't have a family when I'm telling my own stories. You know, I can't. So I try to find that balance, honestly. But the payoff has really been with the, you know, hundreds of people. Maybe I'm getting close to 1,000 actually by now, because I haven't kept track of people that email me and reach out and say, I'm so glad you wrote about this. I'm so glad you talked about this. Your blog helped me in this way. Your podcast helped me in this way. And that's why I do it. I do it for the healing. I don't do it out of a desire to like elevate myself in any way. I actually do it to humanize mediums, because sometimes mediums can get to be, you know, elevated and seen as, I guess, spiritual leaders can be put on a pedestal. And I don't feel like that's where spiritual leaders belong. So I like to approach this field as, hey, you know, look at me. I struggle with these things too. You know, I don't actually have all the answers. I just have a different experience than most people. And I have the advantage of facilitating a lot of these after-death conversations. And I have thoughts about it as an intelligent person, and I want to share those thoughts. But I encourage other intelligent people to keep their brains plugged in and don't just believe what I'm saying because I'm saying it and I'm a psychic, you know, like, and don't believe anyone, any spiritual leader, any guru, any priest or minister, just because they have declared themselves to be a spiritual leader, that they don't have the answers any more than any one of us do. So that's why that's why I do it in the way that I do.
It's definitely a way of staying humble and keeping you, I feel like it keeps you grounded in the practice of what you're doing, because you're always trying to get better at it.
Yeah. And vulnerability is so important in that, because what's more vulnerable than saying, I'm not perfect, I'm a flawed human being.
Right.
You can't, people can't put you on a pedestal. People can't elevate you past themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's a part of this, the sacred in me honors the sacred in you.
Exactly.
It's like I am, I'm talking to people that I genuinely consider my friends. If these are folks that I don't know on a friendship level right now, then I hope that we can become friends someday. And I don't want to be approached in the way of, wow, you have this amazing ability that I don't have. And it's like, well, I have a talent and I have worked at it and I've gotten good at it, but it's really no different from, someone being such a skilled artist that they can create these amazing things that I couldn't create. But I mean, that's the level that I would prefer to be approached on. And I'm very careful when we start talking about these philosophical ideas about life and death and the afterlife, and we're combining it with things that I've experienced in sessions. Mm-hmm. I know that there's a real thing that's going on. I wouldn't have a business if what I was doing wasn't beneficial for people. It's like working in miracles. I can't do anything to make these confirmations happen. Right. They happen spontaneously. I will say a thing and it has a significant meaning to the person that's listening. It's not, I didn't think it up. It came in. So I love working in that kind of miraculous modality. And I feel so lucky to be able to do that. I don't want to have this skill be sort of recategorize me as me or any medium as someone that maybe has access to answers that, no one else does, because I think that's where we can start to get into trouble. And historically we've seen how we've been able to get into trouble.
Right.
So let's learn from history, shall we?
Yes, I think that's a fabulous plan. Well, and I love too, because you kind of, the way that you approach it automatically takes care of that. Well, who's Kate to think that she's the expert on all of this? Mm-hmm. And do you have?
It's like I'm not.
Yeah, that's
yeah. I'm not. I do these sessions and cool things happen, and here's what I think about it. And you can listen or not. That's okay.
Right. I feel like that is so much my approach to podcasting, and like the tutorial videos that I make, and any advice that I give around podcasting. It's like, look, this is based purely on what has worked for me, and there will be other podcast, coaches or consultants or whatever that are like, oh no, you'd never do that. Don't do that. I'm like, how about if we try it? And if it doesn't work, fabulous. But we tried and we know, because I feel like everybody has such a different experience and perspective on how they do the work that they do, especially when it comes to podcasting.
Yeah. And podcasting is awesome. We can do it however we want. I don't have a contract with a radio platform that says I have to produce X amount of content. Like, I get to decide. I'm my own boss. Mm-hmm. Everyone's, all podcasters are their own boss. So I love that we can be creative.
Have you felt the need to get sponsorship or anything like that? Or are you just like, I just want to roll with it like it is because it's working for me?
Well, no, because my podcast is an extension of my blog. Mm-hmm. And the point of the blog and the podcast is to put some of my experiences out there for spiritual, educational enrichment for other people that are interested. And ultimately why, like what I ultimately would like out of it from a monetary point of view is for people to book sessions. Right. So in a way, it wouldn't make any sense for me to get sponsorship on my podcast and sell something else.
Yeah, it totally makes sense.
Because I want, ultimately, if people are interested in clicking on anything, I want them to click on my website, tofinoPsychic.com, and I would like them to read my testimonials. Yes. And I would like them to think about maybe booking their first session with me. So I don't want any other message in there.
Now, let's rewind a little bit, because I want to talk about, why did you start podcasting from your car?
I was really wanting to try to put out content every week. Mm-hmm. Because I knew that the biggest reason why I was growing fairly slowly. I've been doing this since 2012, and I wanted to see how I was just sort of doing this experiment. I wanted to see, well, let's see if I can grow my podcast. Let's see if I can double my listeners or something. I can't remember exactly what my goal was, but I wanted to set a goal. And I do enjoy podcasts that come out every week. And I really wanted to try to have that sort of relationship with my listener where they could look forward to Tuesday when my podcast would come out. I wanted to try. And I thought, well, how can I realistically do this? And I said, well, I know I'm not going to have any time to edit it. So that's when I really took you on. Because, and I'm like, and if it's going to be in the car, it's going to sound like crap. So I better bring Jen on and, make it as listenable as possible. But I thought, well, this commuting time, because I was commuting by myself, this is 45 minutes, every day, twice a day. So instead of listening to podcasts the entire time, I'm like, I could just talk into a microphone one time a week. So I thought that I would try it.
I don't know about you, but do you feel like some of your best stuff comes to you when you're just driving in the car?
Yes. And that's because we're kind of in a bit of a medium mode when we're driving. People don't realize that a lot of people actually have spiritual experiences while they're in the car.
Really?
And it's because our minds our intellect is focused on not killing ourselves, on not going off the road. So that part of our brain that usually gets in the way of telepathic communication is occupied. And that allows these other thoughts to kind of pop in. And that's also why you can have just great conversations in the car. Sometimes you can have really intimate conversations with people just because you're looking forward and you're physically moving forward. And the energy of physically traveling forward helps.
That never would have occurred to me. But hearing you say that makes perfect sense. I know you just launched a course, and I would love to talk about that. Has the course come about because of the podcast?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I'm so stoked for this class. The first time I sat down with a group of people, a group of about 12 people, I sat down here in Tofino, 12 people in a room, and I taught them the basics of telepathic communication. And I loved it. I'm very, very passionate about it. I feel it's a skill set that you don't have to learn it to want you don't have to want to be a professional psychic to get a lot of value out of these skills. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, hospital support worker like I am, and find these skills that help you do your other job better. So I love teaching it. I really wanted to find a way that I could make the basics, like the real ground level work, accessible to people without having to rely on me telling them one to one. Because I loved the class when I facilitated it, but it is so energetically demanding and it's very time-wise demanding for me to do a course for 6 straight weeks. And I was also finding that that 6 weeks was too quick for some people. Like they needed more time to incorporate what was covered in previous lessons. 6 weeks, one lesson every week was too fast a pace. And I understand that from my own college days when I would feel angry and resentful that I had to sacrifice studying for one thing that I didn't understand because I had a test coming up, and strategically it made more sense. It's like, I'm taking this course because I want to learn all of it.
Right. Yeah.
So I was trying to figure out different ways to do that. I'd tried doing, I also wanted it to make it accessible to people who were not in Tofino, because the vast majority of my clients and my listeners and readers are outside of Canada. So I tried doing it over a conference call format. And there was a lot of problems with that.
No. So
I am never going to do that again.
Lesson learned.
Yeah. So lesson learned. I was looking into platforms like Learn It Live, and I, was watching what other psychics were doing, and it never really clicked. It never really felt right with me because I want to give people the freedom to interact with this material at their own pace. So finally, what happened was it was my friend Megan. She's my friend now because we've been working together, but I didn't know who she was when she reached out to me. She lives in Ucluelet, and she had been binging my podcast and reached out to me and said, "Hey, I am developing. I'm new at this, and I could really use some help. And do you teach classes?" And it was just perfect timing because I had just been recovering from surgery. I'd had some surgery in December. And part of my goals for my 8 weeks when I, couldn't really do anything physical was I wanted to finish this course. I have been working on this for 5 years. I've been kind of writing a book. I've been trying to figure out how can I get this stuff out into the world. And I hadn't made any progress while I was recovering from surgery. And then here's Megan showing up saying, can you teach me? And I said, well, yes. How about we do this? How about you come to my house and I will record it, and I will make those lessons available and people can download those MP3s. And in exchange for free lessons, will you write up notes? And then I'll include those notes as a study guide for people. And then that way people can buy the classes 2 at a time and they can listen to them however many times they want. They can go at their own pace. They can hear Megan's struggles. They can listen to me interact. And it was so valuable because teaching isn't just me talking the way often it is in a podcast. I'll just monologue. Mm-hmm. What the beauty of teaching is interacting with someone who is a student who is learning, and they're coming back and asking questions. And the value you get from listening to a student who's participating in this process, mm-hmm. as well as me just talking, you get a much deeper learning experience. And talking about telepathic communication, you also get the benefit of learning energetically with the recording as opposed to just reading words on a page. And that's a little difficult to describe because as people are listening to me now, they're getting a sense of my energy, they're getting a sense of my personality. But when I record demonstrations for Megan, when I'm facilitating a conversation between my cats and Megan, and at the end of one session, I ended up facilitating a conversation between Megan and some of her family members who had passed away. And it was a powerful and deeply emotional experience for Megan. And I wasn't planning on including it in the class. And she included it in the notes as though it was going to be part of it. And I said, well, I can cut this out. Like I wasn't assuming this was going to be a part of it. And she said, no, include it because I think it'll be really valuable for people to listen to. And I'm so grateful she did that because listening, like observing a demonstration of an experienced medium facilitating a conversation, and then also being present with a client and student who is experiencing the emotional release of this powerful experience. There's a lot that you learn from that is difficult to articulate, and listening to the recording of that gives you a chance to learn that energetically and telepathically. And that's a richness of a learning experience that you wouldn't have access to just in a book. So the timing worked out really well. Wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had a podcast. I certainly wouldn't know as much about the audio editing part of it, mm-hmm. Or how just if I hadn't gone through the podcast journey, there's no way I would have been able to do this. So it all builds.
It does. It's just like this. It's kind of like an onion. I feel like if the podcast is the center, and you just kind of go out in different layers. Do you feel like at this point that you are still refining your show?
Yep. I think I'll never be done refining the show. I think every year that's passed, the content changes, the quality, the sound quality gets a bit better. Mm-hmm. I mean, you and I are going to work together, shifting platforms, because I've got it hosted on one platform and I'm going to switch it over to Libsyn with your help. And that's going to improve how the podcast performs because it'll be more easily published. So I think because when I started, I didn't know anything about how to podcast. I never would have started if I hadn't just picked something and said, well, this will work for now. Because if I had set up these unattainable standards, if I had said, well, I'm going to need a mic and I'm going to need to afford Libsyn and I'm going to need to set up a WordPress website, all of these different things that, for example, Daniel J. Lewis had a great mm-hmm. how to podcast set up. And I don't think I would have started podcasting if it weren't for the audacity of podcasting or something. That's mm-hmm. one of the very early podcasts that I listened to. I learned the basics of what I needed to do from his podcast, but then I chose to not listen to him for certain things because it just wasn't feasible. It became a barrier. It's like if I was going to reach those levels, then I just couldn't start. So I just decided I'm going to go ahead and start. And consequently, there's always room for improvement. And I thought that, well, I'll just start and maybe one day I'll get to be weekly. Well, I'll just start and maybe one day I'll have a decent mic, which I do have now. Well, I'll start on this platform and then maybe I'll use Blueberry or Libsyn or, when I get to be bigger and more advanced. And that was a great approach for me. And the other thing is, in the 5 years I've been podcasting, is the tools available to podcasters have exploded. So I'm glad that I didn't invest in some things that would be obsolete now. So yeah, I made doing it my way was absolutely the right decision. And because podcasting is constantly changing, the show is going to always my podcast is going to always be changing and growing and shifting. So it's never going to be done.
I love that approach to it. Just start, just press record and start doing it, because you've got to have a baseline, and nobody ever has to hear those first few episodes. If they're that bad, fine, so be it. But at least you've done them.
Yeah.
I feel like the way that you've approached it is so smart, because one of the biggest barriers to entry is this whole hesitation of, oh, it's got to be perfect. It's got to sound perfect. And I won't say I'm guilty of preaching sound quality, but I kind of am. It is.
Well, it's your job, but it's your job. You're an audio editor, so that is your job, to preach audio purity, right? But it doesn't mean, but you are, at the same time, you're saying, don't let that become a barrier.
Exactly.
Just do your best. Bear in mind audio quality. And the thing is, I get the feedback that people love the rookie episodes.
That's fantastic.
People love that because they love seeing where you came from, and so just share that with people.
It's kind of like punk rock podcasting.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my approach. Punk rock podcasting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just, do it. Safety pin it together.
Exactly. It's perfect.
Pierce it, spray paint it, make it your own. Doesn't matter.
You know what? I think that is a fantastic place to wrap up this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much for having me on.
And before we go, please tell everybody where they can connect with you on social media, on your website, where they can binge listen to the Joyful Telepathy podcast.
All right. So you can find me, you can find everything on tofinopsychic.com. My blog is psychicintraining.com. My podcast is joyfultelepathy.com. You can find me on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. You can search for Kate Sitka, or you can search for Tofino Psychic.
Fabulous. And I will have links to all of that in the show notes. Kate, thank you so much. That was some good stuff, friend. I hope this conversation fired up some ideas for you on how you might use podcasting in your business. I wanted to highlight a few podcasting gems that Kate shared. The biggest one for me is Kate's willingness to just get started podcasting, and then understanding that her show will always be a work in progress as she and her podcast both evolve.
I thought that, well, I'll just start and maybe one day I'll get to be weekly. Well, I'll just start and maybe one day I'll have a decent mic, which I do have now. Well, I'll start on this platform and then maybe I'll use Blueberry or Libsyn or, when I get to be bigger and more advanced. And that was a great approach for me. And the other thing is, in the 5 years I've been podcasting, is the tools available to podcasters have exploded. So I'm glad that I didn't invest in some things that would be obsolete now. So yeah, I made doing it my way was absolutely the right decision. And because podcasting is constantly changing, the show is going to always my podcast is going to always be changing and growing and shifting. So it's never going to be done.
The second point that really jumped out with me in this conversation is not to focus on your download numbers. Share more of yourself and make yourself accessible to people that might want to work with you. Focus on that rather than download numbers.
I just did the podcast as I had time and as it was fun for me. And now I have over 60 episodes out there, and people are binging those 60 episodes before they reach out to me. So I kind of knew that that's how it was going to work for me, that I'm not about getting the numbers. I'm about being accessible, creating more of myself that's accessible to the people that do want to book a session with me.
Kate is one of the first podcasters I've talked to that really views her podcast as a collection, as an entire body of work, rather than an episodic show. And I feel like that's a really interesting perspective and a different way to view the work that we are creating.
I know how I interact with the media, and I don't treat it like a TV show that only comes out once a week. I treat it like a set of DVDs that I own, that I can experience anytime I want. And if I'm a fan of a particular person, I am going to, watch them over and over and over again. If the content is layered enough, dense enough, nuanced enough, then people are going to get more out of it. So I wanted to create a podcast that was interesting enough that people would want to binge on it, and they would want to listen to episodes maybe multiple times over years. So I knew that I was creating more of a body of work rather than a quote unquote show.
I hope this series is shining some light on the variety of ways you can leverage your voice to grow your audience and your business. Visit brassybroad.com for more podcasting resources and tutorials. And if you're ready for the real thing, schedule a workshop session with me. We'll roll up our sleeves and work hands-on through your podcasting questions and challenges. Thanks for listening. Now get out in the world and do some good.